There's a story you've probably heard of before. In the 60s, a war broke out in which two sides, the North and the South, fought over whose ideology would prevail. The North, invoking the name of equality, waged a brutal war with the South, killing many American soldiers. After years of fighting, the North would finally declare victory and establish a military dictatorship over the South. The people of the South, particularly political dissidents, lost the right to private property, the right to own land, the right to vote, and even the right to criticize their own government. As a result, thousands upon thousands would flee on boats to Western countries, hoping that they would be able to regain the rights they had once had. Now, this country that I'm talking about is, of course, the United States of America, during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Let's unpack what I just did there. I showed you pictures of the Vietnam War and used language vague enough that applied both to it and the American Civil War. But are these things even really comparable? One was people fleeing a communist dictatorship, and the other was, well, you've probably never even heard about it. People fleeing Reconstructionist America? What was that? So before we get into why I would even compare American Reconstruction with the subject of this video, that being the question of why do people flee socialist countries, we should first get into the history of Reconstruction itself, so that we can understand what it even is that I am trying to compare. In the 60s, the 1860s, the South seceded from the Union out of fear that slavery would be abolished by the new Lincoln government. This would spark the American Civil War, which to this day is the deadliest war in all of American history, with almost 750,000 people dying, more than almost every other American death in every other American war combined. A quarter of Southern white military-age men died in the war, and in some states it was even worse than that. In Mississippi, for instance, over 1/3 of the soldier population would die, and the majority of the other 2/3 would be left permanently physically disabled. The devastation was so bad that in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War, 1/5 of the entire state budget of Mississippi would be spent buying artificial limbs. The war completely annihilated the South. Atlanta famously was burned to the ground. Not only this, but the end of the war and the abolition of slavery meant that there were now millions of black people without work and who needed protection from embittered white Southerners. The white South saw its economy desolated, with per capita income dropping from $125 before the war to just $80 by 1879. An over-reliance on slavery and agriculture, as well as the loss of a quarter of the white workforce, would cause economic problems for decades to come. The Union also feared a possible return of Southern separatism and the start of a new civil war. The North attempted to deal with these problems through what has been called Reconstruction. Reconstruction, lasting from 1863 to 1877, would be a period of direct Northern military rule over the South, where Union soldiers would, to varying degrees, guarantee the rights of black folks, oversee the massive funding and investment into Southern infrastructure, and occupy direct military power, preventing the rise of Southern revanchism. White men who had had high-ranking positions in the Confederacy were denied the right to vote in order to prevent them from attempting to re-enslave black people or start another civil war. Between 10 and 15,000 ranking members of the Confederacy were outright banned from voting, and voting disenfranchisement would go even further. In Tennessee alone, over 80,000 ex-Confederates were disenfranchised. Reconstruction massively benefited the black population of the South. Black people went from being literal slaves, being owned by the millions, to making up over 15% of all elected Southern officials by 1870, just 5 years after the abolition of slavery. To put that in perspective, 15 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, less than 8% of Southern elected officials were black. Black people would also see a massive rise in living standards, increases in literacy, and freedom of speech and movement. So what was, for white people, specifically upper-class white people, the worst time period in their entire history as Americans, was for black people one of their best. So why am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you this because tens of thousands of upper-class whites would flee the abolition of slavery and the rise of Reconstruction to South America. So many fled, in fact, there would even be a new term coined to describe these people, the Confederados. These Confederados fled by boat thousands of miles to Brazil, where slavery was still legal. Here they founded their own Confederate communities, some of which still exist today, like the city of Americana, Brazil, seen here being visited by American President Jimmy Carter in 1972. This is important, because if you were to listen to the Confederados, they would have told you that they were the oppressed ones, that they had their land and their plantations seized, and their rights stripped, and if you didn't know the proper context, you may have found yourself agreeing with them. But who these Confederados were mattered. The fact that Reconstruction was a major boon to the oppressed black population of the South and a bane to the white upper class is a large part of the reason why the Confederados were basically all white upperclassmen and women. You couldn't just point to them and say, look how evil post-slavery America was, look how many people fled, because those fleeing it represented a very specific subgroup of the nation and didn't represent the nation as a whole. The Confederados were not the average people of the United States, so if you were to say, people fled, without getting into who those people were and why specifically they fled, you would be getting a very wrong view of what was going on and if that society was good or not. Some of you may already see where I'm going with this, so let me just state my general thesis for this video right now. The majority of people, particularly poor people, who have lived in socialist societies have benefited from socialism and approved of their governments, while of those who fled those socialist governments, a majority of them, particularly in the early years, were members of their nation's racial majority and upper class, who disproportionately benefited from the pre-socialist order of economic and racial inequality, and thus they, mostly, do not paint a picture of what life was like for the average person who lived in those societies, and the just look at people fleeing socialism argument is a pretty bad one. To see a good example of what I'm talking about, let's visit one of the most maligned socialist nations in history, one that is perhaps more famous than any other for its people fleeing to the United States, that being communist Cuba. Cuba before socialism suffered under over 400 years of colonial rule. Starting in 1511, the Spanish would conquer Cuba and begin their genocide of the Taino indigenous people, resulting in the death of the vast majority of the population. On top of this, the Spanish would begin bringing slaves to Cuba in the early 1500s, bringing in a total of over 1 million slaves, more than the number that was sent to the United States. This made the transatlantic slave trade in Cuba one of the largest parts of the transatlantic slave trade both by number of slaves and the number of years that slavery was legal. Slavery in Cuba would explode from 1790 to 1819, where the expanse of sugar plantations would cause slave imports to rise by 578%. These slaves were forced to work upwards of 20 hours a day. Not only this, but the vast majority of Cuba's population, even the majority of the white population, lived in immiserating poverty. Cuba would try to break free of Spanish control many times, and in 1895 the Spanish War of Independence would begin. The Spanish response was brutal. In the January of 1897, Spanish General Valeriano Weyler would force over 300,000 Cuban men, women, and children into reconcentrado camps. This is likely where the term concentration camp originated, and of those 300,000 imprisoned, the majority would die. The brutality of the Spanish was then used by the United States as a moral justification of the Spanish-American War, where the United States would overtake Spain as the main ruler of Cuba. The United States would force Cuba to agree to the Platt Agreement, which gave America near total control over Cuba's economy. Not only this, but the United States would militarily intervene whenever it believed its economic interests were threatened, such as in 1906, 1912, and 1917. The one in 1912 saw the black Cuban population angered by mistreatment and racism by the U.S. government, with them breaking into open revolt against the U.S.-owned sugarcane plantations. The U.S. Marine Corps came in and, allied with the Cuban government, massacred upwards of 6,000 black Cubans. Segregation was also legal under American control, and black people were not allowed to live in certain places, allowed access to high-paying jobs, and were generally kept in a subordinate position. Poverty throughout Cuba was infamous, with a quarter of the population being illiterate, and the majority were unable to see a doctor when sick. Here we can see some photos of life in pre-Castro Cuba. As Twitter user Jose Marti suggests, please know that the only black people at the fancy dinners and get-togethers are service workers. It was so bad in Cuba that, in an interview with Lay Express, even John F. Kennedy said, "I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my own country's policies during the Batista regime," Batista being the US-backed dictator who ruled Cuba. In 1959, he was overthrown and Fidel Castro would take power, and immediately set on a massive series of campaigns to better the life of the average Cuban. Literacy would increase to 96% in just 6 months, with it now being 99.6%, higher than that of the United States. Universal health care would be passed, massively increasing the health of the population. Today, Cuba has a life expectancy of over 79 years, longer than that of the United States. Cuba in 1960 had an infant mortality rate of 60 per 1,000. Now it's 4 per 1,000, lower than that of the United States. Cuba is the first country to eliminate HIV transmission from mother to child and has even developed a lung cancer vaccine. Not only did Cuba massively improve its own healthcare system, it gained the ability to massively help others. Cuba has more than 50,000 health professionals in 67 countries. That's more than the MSF, the Red Cross, and UNICEF combined. These professionals have helped many of the world's poorest countries. In 2004 alone, Cuban doctors performed 76 million medical consultations, and over 3 million Africans and South Americans received free eye surgery, mostly for cataracts. More recently, in 2013, 63 million medical consultations were done by Cuba in South America alone. Cuba has made massive strides in hunger relief as well. Before the revolution, they had chronic starvation and malnutrition. Today, Cuba has one of the highest average caloric intakes of any nation on Earth, with an intake of 3,420 calories, the 22nd best in the world. That's better than Finland, 34th, South Korea, 51st, and the Netherlands, 59th. When you compare Cuba to the other major Caribbean nations, the ones the US still has a great deal of major economic control over, it's no contest. Cuba does better at feeding its own people than any of them. This is especially the case in Haiti, which has not had an increase in caloric intake in generations, and where thousands of children are forced to eat bonbon terre, or mud cookies, in order to stave off the feelings of hunger. Going back to Cuba, segregation was also abolished in 1959, 6 years before the United States. Black Cubans gained access to better jobs, gained the right to join unions, and received massive increases in education, literacy, and the end of the white plantation system, in which the descendants of slave owners were able to massively exploit the black descendants of slaves. Most of the Cuban government's progressive actions against racism, however, have been a result of their foreign policy and internationalism. Cuba materially aided 17 African anti-colonial revolutions and provided massive healthcare coverage to millions of Africans thereafter. But probably the most important anti-racist action of the Cuban government was their militant opposition to apartheid South Africa. While the United States supported apartheid South Africa, with the CIA playing a large role in the capture and imprisonment of Nelson Mandela, Cuba sent soldiers to fight against the pro-apartheid forces in Angola and helped bring about the end of apartheid. Nelson Mandela himself said in a speech during his 1991 Cuba visit that, "In Africa, we're used to being victims of countries that want to take from us our territory or overthrow our sovereignty. In African history, there is not another instance where another people has stood up for one of ours. Your presence there and the reinforcements sent to the Battle of Cuito-Cuanavale has a historical meaning. The decisive defeat of the racist army was a victory for all of Africa. This victory is what made it possible for Angola to enjoy peace and establish its own sovereignty. The defeat of the racist army made it possible for all the people of Namibia to achieve their independence. The decisive defeat of the aggressive apartheid forces destroyed the myth of the invincibility of the white oppressor. The defeat of the apartheid army served as an inspiration to the struggling people of South Africa. Without the defeat of Cuito-Cuanavale, our organization would not have been legalized. The defeat of the racist army made it possible for me to be here with you today." This all coalesced into the majority of Cuba's population supporting socialism. Even the United States, Castro's biggest enemy, has estimated that the majority of Cubans supported Castro. So then, if the majority of Cubans support the Cuban government, why have so many people fled? Well, just like with the Confederados, we must ask, specifically, who was it that fled, and why did they flee? And the answer to that question, who fled and why, turns out to be quite similar in Cuba and Reconstructionist America. The majority of people who fled Cuba, particularly in the earliest years, were rich and upper-class whites who benefited from the mass wealth inequality and racism that defined pre-Castro Cuba. During an early wave of Cuban-American immigration in 1964, the journal Social Problems did a study of over 50,000 new Cuban refugees, and found something quite interesting. Comparing various professions of Cubans and finding the percentage of those who worked those jobs in the Cuban population generally, and looking at the professions of Cuban immigrants, we can compare Cuban Americans to the Cuban population at large. For instance, there were 7,858 judges and lawyers in 1953 Cuba, or about 0.4% of the then 1,938,228 census. These jobs are usually upper-class jobs, and of the population of 55,354 Cuban refugees studied, there were 1,695 of those people, or 3.1% of the Cuban immigrant population. This means that Cuban immigrants were 7.8 times more likely than the general Cuban population to be lawyers or judges. Now comparing this to a general poorer person's occupation, like agriculture or fishing, we find that 807,514 people, the single largest chunk, worked in these poor working-class jobs in Cuba, or 51.7% of the population. Yet of those 807,000 workers, only 1,539 left for the States, making Cuban farmers and fishermen about 525 times more likely to stay with the revolution than move to America. This general trend of upper-class people leaving and working-class people staying stays true for the rest of the study. Professionals and semi-professionals make up 5.5 times their fair share of Cuban immigrants, managers and office employees 2.5 times, clerical and salespeople 2.3 times, and police and military 1.1 times. Compare this to skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled labor, I'm not entirely sure why they combine those groups, who, while making up 27.2% of the Cuban population, make up only 20.4% of refugees. The only other jobs next to farmers and fishermen were less than their fair share left. Not only this, but the racial makeup of Cuban immigrants is also quite skewed. Cuba itself is actually quite racially mixed, with only 64% of the island being white and 36% of the island being black or mixed. Compare this to the 2010 census of Cuban Americans, which shows that 85% of American Cubans identify as white, the vast majority. So Cuban American immigrants, particularly those who left in the early years, are significantly whiter and richer than the Cuban population at large. So they are not just some random cross-section of Cuban citizens more broadly who demonstrate the Cuban people's collective disdain for their government. Cuban Americans are disproportionately the descendants or were themselves the wealthy upper class of people who benefited from the pre-Castro order of segregation and massive income disparity. Statistically speaking, the vast majority of black and/or poor Cubans stayed with and supported the revolution. Now, believe it or not, it's not just socialist countries where, after greater levels of equality are reached, massive amounts of the people who benefited from the previous inequality start to flee en masse. Perhaps the best example of this is post-apartheid South Africa. From 1948 to 1991, South Africa existed as a state dedicated to benefiting its white population at the expense of its majority black population. Millions of black people were removed from their land and the majority of the population were forced into extreme poverty. I won't get into the details about the racism of apartheid South Africa as I did for pre-Castro Cuba, because most people already know about the racism of apartheid. But you get the point. Racism is well known. But what isn't as well known is that after apartheid was abolished, over 1 million white South Africans fled back to Europe. That is over 20% of the overall white population. Keep in mind that Mandela, in spite of being a big fan, was no Fidel Castro. Apartheid supporters were not imprisoned, banned from speaking, or oppressed in any real way. In fact, the white population of South Africa continues to live better lives than the black population to this day. In spite of the fact that the black population makes up over 76% of the population and whites make up only 9.1%, black South Africans own just 23% of shared trades on exchange. 58.5% of whites achieve higher levels of education, compared to only 12% of blacks, and the vast majority of land is still white-owned. So just going from having total economic control to merely majority economic control was enough to make over 1 million white South Africans flee back to Europe. Do we consider these people an oppressed group fleeing tyranny? They often try to portray it that way, and if you didn't know the context, you might be convinced. A similar thing happened in post-Portuguese-controlled Africa. After Portugal lost control of Angola and Mozambique, those countries reached a settlement for the withdrawal of the Portuguese Empire. This was followed by over 1 million white Portuguese moving back to Europe, the Retornados. Now, why does that sound familiar? Alright, so let's go back to socialist countries, particularly the most famous one of all time, the Soviet Union. Tsarist Russia was one of the most backwards major countries in Europe. The sizable majority of the country was almost always close to hunger. From 873 to the early 1900s, Russia experienced 120 famines. The chronic hunger was so bad that during many of these famines, millions of peasants were forced into eating what has been called famine bread, which was a mixture of weeds, straw, tree bark, and sand in order to stave off the feelings of hunger. Russian workers labored for 11 hours a day and were the lowest paid and most illiterate population in Europe. This created a lot of popular opposition to the regime, which would only become stronger as Russia entered World War I. Russia was not yet ready for war at this scale, and lost more people during every month of involvement in 1917 than the United States would lose in the entirety of the Vietnam War. This led to the ascension of the Bolsheviks, who would take power in November, with the country being plunged into a civil war not long after. As a result, the Soviet Union had more than 7 million homeless children by 1922. Of these, the majority were boys, who would form gangs in order to steal food and survive. Of the substantial minority that were girls, however, upwards of 88% of those aged 15 and younger became child prostitutes, according to a 1920 survey. With schools shutting down, illiteracy quickly increased, with only 37.9% of all boys and 12.5% of all girls being literate in the late 1910s. After winning the Civil War in 1922, the Bolsheviks pushed forward a series of reforms. The Soviet Union began building millions of houses and successfully abolished homelessness by the 1930s. They also sent out mass literacy brigades in order to teach the illiterate how to read and write, and by 1939 the Soviet Union achieved 89.7% literacy, and about 100% literacy by the 1950s. Food access also shot up. While many people associate the Soviet Union with hunger because of the famines during industrialization and the breadlines during the fall and collapse, during its height the Soviet Union had more food security than almost any nation in human history, comparable to the United States at the time. According to a 1983 document from the CIA, perhaps the most anti-communist source I can think of outside of the Wehrmacht, caloric intake in the USSR was nearly identical to that of the American population, with the Soviet diet being more nutritious. As a result of these achievements, life expectancy in Russia exploded from 32 years in 1913 to 68.6 years for Soviet newborns in 1958. As a result of these reforms, the Soviet government won over the support of the majority of its population. A referendum done on March 17, 1990, showed that 76.4% of Soviet citizens supported the continued existence of the USSR. Some will try to argue that these results must have been faked, but the fact that the United States had to interfere in the 1996 Russian election to stop the communists from taking power again showed that the majority of the population did back the communists. To this day, the majority of ex-communist countries look back at communism favorably. 75% of Russians say the Soviet era was the greatest time in their country's history, while independent polling shows that Joseph Stalin has a 70% approval rating among Russians. And it's not just in Russia. 70% of Tajikistan longs for the Soviet era. 72% of Hungarians say they are worse off now than they were under communism. Even 57% of East Germans, when polled, say their life was better under communism. So if the majority of the ex-communist population say they prefer communism, just who was it that left then? Well, the first people to flee socialism en masse were the white émigrés, who fled to the USSR after the victory of the Bolsheviks and the fall of the white reactionary movement. Of the 1 million to flee, the majority were of the upper class, who were the very few to have benefited from the Tsarist regime. Some of these were simply scientists, writers, and political minorities, but there were also less savory characters, like future Nazis Schubner Richter and Alfred Rosenberg. This is true in Vietnam as well. After the war, the first 130,000 Vietnamese to migrate to the United States were supporters of the American occupation, and were moved to the States via Operation New Life and Operation New Arrivals. The majority of these, of course, being the upper class, who would have benefited from U.S. control and the maintaining of capitalism. So the majority of the population in all of these countries are in favor of socialism and remain in their country, while the minority of the previous upper class seeks refuge. But, although this is true the majority of the time, it doesn't make it true all of the time. If you've been paying close attention, you would notice that when I talk of upper class people fleeing socialism, I often preface it by saying, in the early years of emigration, or at first. This is because, to be completely fair to the people who disagree with me, not everyone who flees socialist countries is a member of the previous society's upper class. There have been poor people who have fled socialism, and as time goes on, they tend to make up a larger chunk of those fleeing than they did in previous years, although still less than their respective populations. Take Vietnam, for instance, where some 800,000 boat people, the people I loosely referenced in the beginning of my video, left Vietnam. As far as I've been able to tell, the boat people were about as well off or worse off as the rest of the Vietnamese population. A similar thing happened in the 1980s in Cuba called the Mariel Boat Lift, where 125,000 Cubans left Cuba by boat during a Cuban recession. But doesn't that prove the capitalist point? That poor people were fleeing towards capitalism and away from socialism in order to get a better life? Well, not so fast. We need to take some proper context into account to compare socialist and capitalist economies. In 1986, back when there were still many socialist countries, a study was published in the American Journal of Public Health by California State University professor of sociology Shirley Credo and University of California professor of social science Howard Watson, comparing quality of life in both socialist and capitalist countries. It found that, at equal levels of development, socialism provided better living standards across the board. The World Bank, hardly pro-communist, was their primary source, and they analyzed 123 countries containing 97% of the world's population. The main objects of comparison were 1. Indicators of health, health services, and nutrition, so infant mortality rate, child death rate, life expectancy, population per physician, population per nursing person, and daily per capita caloric supply. 2. Measures of education, so adult literacy rate, enrollment in secondary education, and enrollment in higher education. And 3. a complete PQL index, PQL meaning physical quality of life. They found that capitalist countries had an infant mortality rate and child death rate 2 to 3 times lower than similar capitalist countries. They also found that socialist countries had a 12 to 15% higher average caloric intake, over twice the adult literacy rate in low-income countries, and a 10-year longer life expectancy in comparable nations. The study concludes, our analysis of the World Bank's data supports the conclusion that, in the aggregate, the socialist countries have achieved more favorable PQL outcomes than capitalist countries at equal levels of economic development. But notice how they say at equal levels of development. In order to completely compare capitalist and socialist countries, you have to take into account their developmental contexts. When people talk about capitalist countries, they're usually not talking about third world countries like Sudan, the Congo, or the rest of the third world. No, when capitalists talk about the wealth of capitalism, they're usually talking about countries in Western Europe or the United States, countries that gained much of their wealth from centuries of colonialism. The vast majority of socialist countries, Vietnam, China, Burkina Faso, Cuba, were countries that were colonized for generations, so they did not have equal starting points. Not only did capitalist countries predate the socialist ones, and thus have centuries of time to build up their economies over them, but their economies were built up largely by stealing and impoverishing the countries that would go socialist. Now, countries that would go socialist did face economic issues, and some of these were in part due to inefficiency of planning and economic miscalculations, but a lot of the economic problems that socialist countries went through, they had to deal with because of capitalist nations, not wanting to lose access to their markets, doing everything in their power to prevent them from going socialist. For a good example of this, let's again turn to Cuba. After revolutionary Cuba was founded in 1959, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Lester D. Malroy, wrote out a proposed sanction to be applied to Cuba with the explicit aim of destroying its economy and starving its people. This proposed sanction can be found on an official U.S. government website, linked below. It reads, Subject: The decline and fall of Castro. Salient considerations respecting the life of the present government of Cuba are 1. The majority of Cubans support Castro. The lowest estimate I have seen is 50%. 2. There is no effective political opposition. 3. Fidel Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence. 4. Communist influence is pervading the government and the body politique at an amazingly fast rate. 5. Militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. 6. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. If the above are accepted or cannot be successfully countered, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This proposed sanction, again done with the explicit intention to starve the Cuban population, was signed into law by Dwight D. Eisenhower less than 1 year later, and remains in effect until this very day. For over 3 generations, the world's largest economy has been and is, by its own admission, trying to starve the population of a small island nation about 90 miles away, by preventing any amount of trade. Again, this is on a U.S. official government website. This is an official declassified document. In its own words, the U.S. government is trying to starve the population of Cuba, and has been for almost 60 years. The U.S. not only sanctions Cuba and refuses to trade with it, the U.S. also puts massive pressure on almost every other country on Earth not to trade with Cuba. It doesn't matter what kind of economic model you follow, any economy in these conditions is going to have trouble. I'd also like to draw attention to the starve them as adroit and inconspicuously as possible part. The U.S. government isn't just trying to starve Cuba, it's trying to do so as quietly as possible. This is why, even though the U.S. government openly admits to it, the vast majority of the U.S. population is ignorant about what is being done to Cuba. One of the reasons why I think it's so easy for some people to hand-wave the argument that Western capitalism is largely responsible for the problems of socialist economies is because the vast majority of our population is purposely kept ignorant of what our governments have done. It's very easy to laugh at the idea that America causes economic issues in socialist countries with a reply of, "Oh, so it's not socialism's fault that socialism sucks," if you don't know the proper context. If you didn't know the broader history and material conditions of these societies, and that the world's richest countries, well established for hundreds of years, openly admit to doing everything in their power to destroy them, you probably would come to the conclusion that they just fail on their own. And this is not the only example of a powerful Western nation trying to destroy new socialist economies. After the founding of the Soviet Union in 1917, 14 capitalist countries invaded Russia with the attempt of killing Lenin and preventing the rise of socialism. The United States, Britain, Japan, France, Italy, China, and over a half-dozen other countries all invaded the USSR. After the Bolsheviks won, they were immediately sanctioned and economically isolated. The United States killed 3 million Koreans and 3.8 million Vietnamese after they went communist, and sanctioned them not long after. Even countries which leaned towards a more moderate democratic socialism were not spared. The U.S. overthrew democratically elected governments in the Congo, Iran, Greece, Indonesia, and basically every country in South America. Socialist countries not only had to make functioning economies out of countries which had had their resources stolen for hundreds of years, they also had to deal with the constant coup attempts, military invasion, sanctions, and even genocides, such as in Nicaragua and Indonesia. Comparing economies which came out of this to Western capitalist nations is, to say the least, very misleading. Now maybe you could say that the people were not necessarily fleeing the economic conditions of socialism, but rather were fleeing their totalitarian governments. There are some problems with that. For one, the vast majority of countries that went socialist were already dictatorships before the revolution. Cuba was ruled by the dictator Batista, South Vietnam was ruled by the dictator Ngo Dinh Diem, China had Chiang Kai-shek, and so on. So if they fled for reasons of political oppression, then why didn't they flee during the previous dictatorship? Well, perhaps you'll respond, maybe it's because the socialist states were worse than their previous capitalist and feudalist dictatorships. Well, in response to this, we have a memorandum done by the CIA itself. It reads, "It is estimated that roughly 20,000 politically inspired murders and deaths during revolutionary action occurred during Batista's last term in office. However, no accurate estimate is possible. Most of these deaths took place during 1957 and 1958 as Castro's revolutionary threat became progressively more potent and as the Batista regime sought to counter it with a campaign of terror." It later goes on, "Anti-Castro exile groups estimate that since Castro's coming to power in January 1959, there have been nearly 2,500 people executed by the regime. Some 800 executions have been publicly announced by the regime. There is no information to permit an accurate estimate of the numbers of executions, but it is known that there have been way more than have been publicly announced." Later continues, "In addition, there have been sporadic killings by anti-Castro forces of Castro's militiamen and other officials. However, the large-scale campaigns of murders and terrorism characteristic of the last years of the Batista regime have not occurred during the Castro regime." So even the CIA, who were the primary funders of Fulgencio Batista, and who tried to assassinate Fidel Castro 638 times, estimated to the best of their ability that Batista killed far more people than Castro in the beginning of Castro's rule, where the vast majority of killings happened. And yet, even though Batista killed 20,000, while anti-Castro sources say he killed 2,500, far more people fled Castro than fled Batista. Why is this? Well, it's because Batista was predominantly persecuting brown and poor people, while Castro was predominantly persecuting the upper class, who had the incentive as well as the means to flee. So the argument of, well, they're fleeing dictatorship for freedom, doesn't exactly hold up. When the previous dictatorships held and wielded dictatorial power on their class's behalf, they did not flee, even when the dictatorships were much more deadly. Okay, even so, I can hear some of you saying, these people fled from socialist nations to capitalist ones. That doesn't happen the other way around. Except that it does. During the 1930s, the United States and the rest of the capitalist world were in the middle of the Great Depression. During the same time period, the USSR, economically isolated from the West, was experiencing a period of unprecedented economic growth. As a result of this, tens of thousands of people from capitalist countries flocked to the Soviet Union. Cambridge University Press estimates that from 1917 to 1939, between 70 and 80,000 foreign workers immigrated to the USSR via Soviet agencies like Armtong and the Society for Technical Aid to Soviet Russia. Over 100,000 Americans applied for immigration, and tens of thousands were accepted. Workers were also not the only ones to leave capitalist countries for the USSR. Thousands of African Americans and women also moved in search of greater equality, as books like Black, Reds, and Russians and American Girls in Red Russia detail. Many famous black people, from Harlem Renaissance leader Langston Hughes to singer Paul Robeson, visited the Soviet Union and came back to the United States and described what they viewed as much greater racial equality. This caused thousands of African Americans to move to the Soviet Union, particularly to places like Uzbekistan. And all of this is just during the pre-war period. After World War II, the Soviet Union would set up a massive series of universities designed to educate people from the predominantly capitalist Third World. The Patrice Lumumba University provided free scholarships to Third World people, and it, along with similar universities, would see almost 400,000 Africans study in the USSR from the late 1950s to 1990. The CIA itself estimated in 1965 that from 1956 to 1965, more than 11,500 foreign students went to study in Russia, with the number increasing every year. So yes, people have gone from capitalist countries to socialist ones. Okay, I can hear some of you argue, but still those aren't as large a number as the people who fled socialism. People still flee socialism more than they flee capitalism. Except people do flee capitalism more than socialism, at least in the case of Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Soviet Union and introduction of a market economy devastated the population, resulting in massive increases in suicide, alcoholism, depression, and general death. A 2017 study by the prestigious medical journal The Lancet found that rapid privatization of the post-Soviet economy was a massive contributor to the 7 million excess deaths post-Soviet countries experienced from 1990 to 1995. This caused a massive population decline. From a Soviet height of 2.66 million people, Latvia is down to 1.92 million people as of 2019. From 1991 to 2015, the Baltic states and Bulgaria lost 16 and 26% of their populations respectively. Ukraine's population went from 52.4 million in 1990 to 43.7 million in 2020. Part of the decline is caused by low birth rates and mass death, yes, but a great deal is caused by emigration. People leaving the economically weak post-socialist East. Between 2 and 4 million Ukrainian workers have left the country. Massive numbers of people have left the capitalist East. Okay, I can hear some of you say, but the Soviet Union restricted emigration, and these countries don't, so isn't that kind of an unfair comparison? Okay, fair enough, but the thing is, as we have already covered, the sizable majority of the population liked communism, so this wasn't just people wanted to flee but couldn't. They didn't because they didn't want to, predominantly. Now, I'm not saying that socialist countries have never done anything wrong. There have been more than enough purges and gulags to disprove that idea. I'm not arguing they were perfect. I mean, they don't exist anymore, that would be pretty hard to argue. And I'm not arguing that no innocent people have ever been hurt by and thus fled communism. I'm sure there are going to be people watching this who had family members persecuted by socialist governments, and I'm certain that not all of these people are descendants of upper-class people who oppressed poor people. There is a sign outside Havana that reads, 200 million children in the world today sleep in the streets. None of them are Cuban. And a popular leftist joke response to this has been to say that, well, of course, some of them are Cuban. I mean, just look at Miami. This dark joke underlies an actual serious point. Miami has a very high homeless population, with even the daughter of Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista herself being homeless as of 2017. It's weird to think about, but thousands of Miami Cubans have actually considered going back to Cuba. There is genuine suffering here. Those people certainly exist, but they are the minority. A minority of the people in socialist nations seek to flee. Of that minority, the majority are members of their society's previous upper class. There is the minority of the minority who are average everyday people seeking to flee for greater economic prosperity, but the conditions they are fleeing to and from were in part due to massive sanctions, wars, and imperialism of those capitalist nations. Capitalist nations do not care about the well-being of people from socialist nations, not even for the people who flee from them. America only values the people fleeing socialism as political tools who can be used to demonstrate capitalism's supposed superiority. They don't care about the life or well-being of anyone who has actually fled communist repression, and there is no better example to demonstrate this than to go to where we all began in the first place, Cuba. After Batista was unable to stop the revolution, and the hundreds of assassination attempts on Castro all failed, the Department of Justice and Joint Chiefs of Staff came up with a way to finally overthrow Castro. It was called Operation Northwoods. This plan was centered around doing false flag operations, blaming them on the Cuban government, and using those false flags to justify invasion. These proposed false flags, taken seriously by the higher-ups in the U.S. government and vetoed by Kennedy, involved assassinating Miami migrants, sinking boats of Cuban refugees, killing hundreds if not thousands of them. As I said in the beginning of my video, the majority of people, particularly poor people, who have lived in socialist societies have benefited from socialism and approved of their governments, while of those who fled, The socialist countries, a massively disproportionate number of them were members of their nation's upper class, who disproportionately benefited from the pre-socialist order of economic inequality, and so the "just look at all the people fleeing socialism" argument is a pretty bad one. Thank you for watching. This video is part of a new project of mine meant to create what I hope to be solid counter-arguments to the most common anti-communist arguments. So if you think this video did a good job of refuting the "if socialism is so good, why do people flee it" argument, I would very much appreciate it if you were to share it, both with leftists and reactionaries. My next video should be a response to the "communism killed 100 million people" argument, so stay tuned.